I walked into Westbourne and Company when the company had more debt than furniture. We were crammed into a second-floor office that smelled like old coffee and desperation. The carpet was frayed, the windows leaked when it rained, and the only thing keeping the lights on was Richard Westbourne's charm and our collective blind hope. I was 24. No fancy degree. Just grit, an eye for numbers, and a willingness to outwork anyone. Richard saw that in me from day one. He wasn't like most bosses. He didn't care where you came from, only where you were willing to go. So I stayed late, arrived early, and kept my head down. I didn't just want to be good. I wanted to build something that mattered. And we did. Over the next decade, we turned that shaky startup into a well-oiled machine. When competitors cut corners, we doubled down on quality. When others panicked during economic dips, we innovated. I was there through every growing pain, every hard-earned win. I sat in on key negotiations, managed our biggest client relationships, and personally saved a 7-figure deal that would have sunk us had it gone sideways. Richard used to joke that I bled Westbourne blue. But it wasn't a joke. Not to me. That place wasn't just a job. It was a legacy. And Richard, he wasn't just my boss. He became something like a father figure, one who saw potential in me long before I did. He'd say things like, "This company needs warriors, not suits," and when he looked at me, I knew he meant it. Over time, he started pulling me into confidential discussions, things only family or board members were supposed to know. There were late-night emails about future expansion plans, licensing talks, and even some quiet conversations about exit strategies. I didn't ask too many questions. I just did the work and earned his trust, one late night at a time. By year 15, I had unofficially become his right hand. Employees came to me before they went to HR. Clients asked for me by name. If Richard was the heart of the company, I was the spine. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was respected, and more importantly, I was trusted. But nothing gold stays. When Richard announced his retirement due to health reasons, there was a quiet panic. Everyone wondered what would happen next, but I didn't. I thought he had a plan. I thought he'd prepared for this. He had. Just not in the way any of us expected. Because his successor wasn't a seasoned executive, or even a senior partner. It was his son, Colton Westbourne, a name that sounded more like a fashion brand than a business leader. And on the day that Spoiled Air strutted into our office for the first time, everything I had built started to crack. The announcement came on a Monday morning, slipped quietly into everyone's inbox at 7:02 a.m. The subject line, leadership update. No one even blinked at first. We all assumed Richard was just naming a new COO or taking on an advisory role. But when I opened the message and saw the words effective immediately, my stomach turned. Richard was stepping down. Permanently. Due to ongoing health concerns. No warning. No farewell. Just a paragraph that ended with, "The board has appointed Colton Westbourne as the new CEO." Colton. The name hit like a slap. We all knew Colton, or at least we'd heard the stories. Richard's only son. MBA from some overpriced East Coast school. Preferred golf clubs over boardrooms and Instagram reels over spreadsheets. He wasn't just green, he was fluorescent. The kind of guy who thought synergy meant putting all the interns in one Slack channel. Still, I told myself to breathe. Maybe Richard had a plan. Maybe Colton would step in, observe, listen. Maybe he'd lean on people like me who'd carried this company through storms. But then came the town hall. It was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp, mandatory attendance. The room was packed by 9:50. People were buzzing, half anxious, half curious. And then he walked in. Tailored navy suit. Rolex peeking from his cuff. Perfectly styled hair that looked like it had its own publicist. And that smirk. Like he just walked onto the set of a reality show instead of a boardroom filled with real people with real lives. He strutted to the podium, clutched the mic with one hand, and leaned in like he was about to deliver a punchline. "Good morning," he said with faux sincerity. Or should I say, good new morning. Because starting today, Westbourne and Company is stepping into its future. My vision. My team. You could feel the tension shift. People exchanged glances. Some confused. Others already regretting showing up. Colton continued. I've been reviewing the way this place runs, and frankly, it's bloated. Too many old systems. Too many old faces. We need new blood. Fresh thinking. Modern leadership. That last line. He locked eyes with me when he said it. I didn't flinch. I'd faced real threats before. Negotiations where millions were on the line. But something about the way he looked at me wasn't business. It was personal. Like he'd already made up his mind about me. By the end of that speech, it was clear. He wasn't here to lead. He was here to conquer. Wipe the slate clean. Make the company his. No matter who got stepped on in the process. And sure enough, just 3 days later, he made his first move. 3 days after the town hall, we got a calendar invite that just said, Department heads, meet the new era. No agenda. No details. Just a location, executive conference room, 10th floor. The floor no one used unless there were board members or high-stakes investors in town. That floor used to feel sacred. Glass walls, quiet carpets, panoramic city views that reminded you why the grind was worth it. But that day as we walked in it felt different. Like something pure had been gutted. Colton was already there, perched at the head of the table like a prince on a throne he didn't earn. Legs crossed, arms folded, phone face down but vibrating every few seconds. He didn't stand to greet us. Didn't shake a single hand. Just flashed that smug lip-curled smirk and motioned for everyone to sit. There were 15 of us, directors, VPs, team leads. People who had held this place up with blood, sweat, and after-hours pizza. And we sat there like we were back in high school, waiting for a substitute teacher who didn't know our names. Let's make this quick, he said, spinning a Mont Blanc pen between his fingers. You're all here because you lead something. That's cute. But leadership is about vision. It's about reinvention. It's about knowing when to cut loose what's stale. He scanned the table like a casting director deciding who was getting cut from the show. Some of you are safe for now. Some of you. Well, let's say your reputations are more tied to my father than to actual results. And let's be honest, it's time to update the cast list. He didn't even blink when he said it. Just stared across the table and again, let his eyes settle on me a moment longer than necessary. People shifted in their chairs. No one spoke. Then with mock sweetness he added, Oh, and by the way, if anyone's wondering whether tenure matters here, it doesn't. Results do. Loyalty is cute, but irrelevance is a liability. It was a shot fired, and we all knew who it was aimed at. I stayed silent. My instinct told me this wasn't the moment to speak. Not yet. Let him feel confident. Let him believe the room was his. The meeting ended without discussion. Just a thinly veiled warning disguised as a pep talk and a final line. Get ready for changes. Big ones. Starting this week. As we stood to leave, Colton looked directly at me and said, Looking forward to seeing how you adapt. He nodded. Controlled. But inside, I already knew something he didn't. He thought he was walking into a kingdom. What he didn't realize was that I had helped build it brick by brick, and buried something in the foundation. It happened on a Thursday morning, one of those gray, overcast days when everything already feels a little heavier. The kind where your coffee tastes burnt, and the office hum feels louder than usual. I remember because I hadn't even finished replying to my first email when the company-wide alert came in. Mandatory staff assembly. 10:30 a.m. main hall. Attendance required. That was unusual. Colton wasn't the type to speak to everyone at once. He preferred curated meetings, small groups he could dominate. So a full staff assembly felt calculated. The main hall was buzzing when I arrived. Over 100 employees crammed into rows of foldable chairs. Some whispered, others scrolled their phones nervously. The last time Richard had gathered the full staff like this, it was to announce our largest expansion deal. There'd been applause. Laughter. Not today. Colton walked in with 2 assistants flanking him like bodyguards. No notes. No slides. Just him and that ever-present designer suit. This time a sharp charcoal gray paired with a black shirt, no tie. Power play. He stepped up to the mic, adjusted it like he'd done it 1,000 times, and gave a small smirk. "Hey team," he began, fake casual. "I wanted to talk to all of you together, directly. Because we're entering a new phase. An era of innovation, disruption, and decisive leadership." He talked for 5 minutes about change, about agility, about streamlining for growth. Corporate gibberish. Polished and delivered with the charm of a tech bro auditioning for Shark Tank. Then his tone shifted. "But let's be honest," he said, scanning the room. "Some things can't grow unless we prune the dead branches." He paused. The silence was thick. "Which is why I'm making an executive decision. Effective immediately. We'll be parting ways with someone who's been here a long time. Someone who's had their moment." And then he said my name. Loud. In front of everyone. I didn't blink. A few heads turned toward me. Some gasped. Others froze mid-scroll. No one said a word. Colton didn't stop there. He chuckled and added, "It's nothing personal. It's just time for new blood. You can thank my father for the training wheels, but I'm taking them off." It was humiliating, but not in the way he thought. Because while he saw a man getting fired, I knew I was watching a fool pull the pin out of a grenade, thinking it was a pen. I stood up, straightened my jacket, met his eyes without a single shake in my breath. Then quietly I walked to the exit, every step measured, every heartbeat calm. I didn't say a word, but I smiled. And that smile, that was the beginning of the end for Colton Westburn. I walked out of that building like it was just another Thursday. No tears. No yelling. No dramatic final words. Just silence. And a smile that probably confused the hell out of everyone watching. I could feel their eyes on my back. The whispers starting. The shock sinking in. A few colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One even stood halfway as if to stop me, but sat back down when Colton glanced his way. He wanted a scene. He wanted me to explode. Beg. Fight. Instead I gave him nothing. The security guard at the front desk, Jerry, an ex-Marine with a soft spot for crossword puzzles, stood as I passed. His brows were furrowed, lips tight. He didn't say anything either, but when he reached out to shake my hand, it spoke volumes. "You good," he finally whispered. He nodded. "Better than he is." And I meant it. Because while Colton thought he had just made a power move, cleaning house, cutting dead weight, he didn't know the weight he just severed was the foundation holding up his little empire. I didn't go home right away. I went for a walk instead. Downtown was loud, horns, footsteps, life buzzing around me, but inside I felt eerily still. My mind wasn't racing. It was calculating, reviewing everything I'd built, every late night, every handshake deal Richard had made with me off the books. You see, what Colton didn't know was that Richard Westburn wasn't just a boss. He was a strategist, a man who believed in loyalty but understood the volatility of legacy. He used to say, "Blood may inherit a name, but loyalty earns the keys." And Richard had given me a few keys. I just never had to use them until now. The next day, I boxed up my home office, pulled out an old fireproof folder labeled Private RW, and started going through documents I hadn't touched in years. There it was, signed paperwork, notarized, witnessed, and sealed. Ownership clauses, licensing agreements, strategic supplier contracts where my name was listed as primary liaison. Stuff Colton had clearly never read, probably didn't even know existed. It was all still in place. Because while Colton inherited the title, he never earned the trust. And Richard never updated the core agreements. He had always said, "If something ever happens to me, I need to know this place will survive." And he chose me. By the weekend I was already making calls. Quiet ones. Strategic ones. To vendors, suppliers, old partners. Not threats, just conversations. I didn't have to beg anyone. Most were already fuming about how Colton was handling things. They'd been waiting for a reason to walk. Now they had one. I wasn't out for vengeance. Not yet. This wasn't about burning bridges. It was about reclaiming what I helped build. Colton thought he'd erased me from the company. But what he really did was set the first domino in motion. And I was going to make sure he watched every single one fall. The documents were older than I remembered, dated back nearly a decade. I laid them out across my dining table, careful not to smudge the signatures. Each one was meticulously organized, notarized, witnessed, and tucked away in the exact order Richard had left them in. And at the very top was the clause, buried on page 6 of a licensing agreement we'd signed during a critical merger year. The language was clear, deliberately so. In the event of executive restructuring or corporate transfer of majority ownership, all proprietary licensing, supplier exclusivity, and product IP management shall defer to the co-signatory listed as strategic liaison until a formal review by the legacy board. That co-signatory, me. It was one of those silent power moves Richard had always made behind the curtain. He believed in contingency, in having a chessboard ready while everyone else was still shuffling checkers. I had forgotten just how much control he had quietly handed me. Not equity shares on paper to flash at board meetings, but real influence, functional power, access to patents, supplier deals that couldn't legally continue without my cosign, even the software backbone we developed in-house. The license was registered in my name, tied to an LLC Richard helped me set up years ago, just in case. Colton thought he'd removed me with a microphone and a smirk. He didn't realize he'd fired the only person holding the keys to the company's infrastructure. The next call I made was to Sasha in legal, an old friend who used to handle corporate IP compliance for Westbourne and Company before Colton replaced half the team with his frat brothers and golf buddies. She picked up after 2 rings. "Are you calling to say, 'I told you so'?" she asked dryly. "Not yet," I replied. "But I might need a coffee and a quiet place to go over some contracts." We met that afternoon. Her jaw tightened as she read through the folder. He didn't revoke any of this. Nope. He signed off on a mass firing without checking the licensing files. I just smiled. She leaned back in her chair, tapping the table thoughtfully. "You could stop him cold." "That's not the plan," I said. "Not yet. Because stopping Colton would be too easy. What I wanted was exposure. I wanted him to dismantle the company with his own arrogance. To fire me thinking he was cutting fat, only to discover he'd severed an artery. I wanted every decision he made from here to dig the hole deeper, while I watched from the edge, holding the rope he never knew he'd need. So I waited, quietly, methodically, because revenge wasn't about rage. It was about patience, and the first fracture was already showing. It started as a whisper. Supplier delay here. A vendor suddenly reassessing their terms. A key logistics partner claiming their renewal system was down. Nothing loud. Nothing dramatic. Just the soft, subtle sound of a machine slowing down. And Colton. He was too busy basking in his illusion of control to notice. From the outside, everything still looked normal. He was hosting flashy lunches with influencers, pushing out polished press releases about the new vision, even filming internal video memos where he called himself the disruptor this company needs. But behind that sleek curtain, cracks were forming. See, what Colton didn't know, what he never bothered to learn, was that relationships in business aren't transactional. They're personal. And almost every key vendor, client, and strategic partner we had come through me. Over the years, I didn't just manage deals. I built trust, flew out to meet people's families, attended weddings, sat at hospital bedsides. I was the name they called when deadlines were tight or things went sideways. And now, with me suddenly gone, and in the manner I was gone, they didn't just see a corporate shift. They saw a red flag. And I didn't have to say a word. They called me. It began with an email from Gareth, the COO of our largest raw materials supplier. Subject line: "He really fired you." I replied with a single sentence: "Let's catch up soon." That same week, the company's production orders were mysteriously delayed. The official reason was internal miscommunication. But Gareth knew. And so did I. Then came Camille, our lead software vendor from France. She cancelled 2 key integration projects, citing licensing irregularities. Because, as it turned out, the IP was still under my LLC, and no one had transferred the usage rights legally. Each day something else crumbled. The shipping schedule unraveled. 2 international clients suspended their contracts. And investors. They began calling the board, not Colton, for answers. He tried to cover it up with corporate jargon. Strategic reevaluation, platform reset, supplier realignment. But internally the panic had started. People in the office whispered when he walked by. Slack channels went eerily quiet. The energy that once buzzed through the place had turned brittle. He called an emergency meeting with department heads and opened with, "Who's leaking information?" No one answered. 'Cause there were no leaks. The company wasn't being attacked from the outside. It was rotting from within, from the roots he'd cut without understanding what they were connected to. And the deeper he sank, the more he flailed. He didn't know it yet, but the countdown had started. The empire he thought he ruled was already falling. The letter went out on a Tuesday morning. Not an email. Not a phone call. A thick, cream-colored envelope, delivered by courier to the Westbourne and Company headquarters. Handed directly to Colton by the receptionist, who, bless her heart, had no idea she was handing him a live grenade. Inside was a formal notice of breach of contract and intent to litigate. 10 pages. Each line drafted with surgical precision. Sasha and I spent weeks assembling it. Every clause Colton violated when he fired me without cause. Every licensing agreement that was invalidated the second my name was removed from the internal registry. Every contract that required my approval before renewal. And most damning of all, the termination itself, delivered without board review, and in direct violation of a succession clause Richard Westbourne had personally signed. In that clause, Richard stated that no foundational personnel shall be removed or reassigned without legal cause or documented failure to perform, subject to board approval. Colton skipped the board. Skipped the paperwork. He skipped everything. 'Cause he thought he was untouchable. Now he was bleeding. By Wednesday, his assistant was calling Sasha's office in a panic, trying to clarify intent. By Friday, 3 members of the board had demanded an emergency session to review leadership stability. But the real hit, that came from the legal department's internal memo, leaked by a still loyal analyst, which revealed that due to the IP license revocation and partnership dissolutions, the company was already in breach of 4 major contractual obligations. Liabilities. Over $12 million in damages projected. And climbing. HR scrambled. PR went into overdrive. But it was too late. The story broke late Friday night. First as a blog post, then as a full article on Business Insider. CEO faces lawsuit after firing key partner. Westbourne legacy at risk. Within hours it hit LinkedIn, Reddit, industry forums. Even a few former employees started posting passive-aggressive, "told you so" memes. But the headline that really sank in. From boardroom to bombshell. How nepotism is tearing Westbourne and Company apart. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. This wasn't about going viral. This was about sending a message. One Colton couldn't ignore, spin, or smirk his way out of. He had made the mistake of treating business like a game. But I was never playing. And now the board, his board, was asking questions. Questions he couldn't answer. Because the truth was finally out. The man he fired wasn't just some relic from the past. I was the past. And the future he thought he owned was legally tied to everything he just destroyed. By the time the second lawsuit landed on Colton's desk, the office wasn't just tense, it was radioactive. People stopped talking in the elevators. Team leads began forwarding all memos, for record keeping. Slack threads disappeared. Colton's once favored executive assistant quietly requested a transfer to an out-of-state office. And the company's CFO, who'd been there since before I joined, went on indefinite medical leave. Everyone knew what that meant. Westbien and Company wasn't just slipping. It was crashing. The legal fallout triggered a chain reaction no amount of PR could fix. Half our overseas operations froze after licensing rights were rescinded. The software that powered our supply chain integrations offline pending ownership verification, because the LLC still bore my signature. Orders piled up. Clients threatened litigation of their own. And with every passing day, more vendors jumped ship, citing unresolvable management conflict. Colton's daily routine shifted from pep talks and power poses to damage control and finger-pointing. He called emergency meetings where no one spoke. Sent all company emails asking for trust in the transition. Even tried to resurrect the same buzzwords he used on day one: disruption, agility, rebranding. But none of that could hide the truth. The company was imploding, and he was at the epicenter. Staff started quitting. Quietly at first. Designer here. Project lead there. But by the second week, it became a wave. Entire teams left together, walking out in silence. Some had job offers. Most didn't. But none of them were willing to stick around and watch the train wreck in slow motion. The board. Useless. Half of them were still scrambling to figure out what Richard had set in motion with all the off-book agreements. The other half were in damage control mode, trying to salvage their reputations before shareholders came knocking. And Colton. He was unraveling. He stopped showing up to the office. Began working from his penthouse and issued orders through pre-recorded video messages, each one more defensive than the last. In one, he said, "The challenges we're facing are temporary. Loyalty will be rewarded." People laughed out loud when it played in the break room. The empire he'd inherited was dying before his eyes, and he couldn't understand why. Because he never learned how it was built. He thought the company was made of logos, press kits, and quarterly reports. But it was made of people. People who remembered what loyalty felt like. People who now looked to me. Because while he sat behind tinted glass, trying to salvage his image, I was quietly building something new. Something better. And unlike him, I wasn't inheriting anything. I was earning it. It wasn't just a fall. It was a spectacle. By the end of the third week, the media caught blood in the water, and they pounced. First, it was a quiet mention on a local business podcast. Unconfirmed reports suggest Westbien and Company may be facing internal turmoil under its new leadership. Soft jab, barely noticed. But 48 hours later, the real blow came. A full exposé in the Financial Tribune, complete with anonymous employee interviews, leaked internal memos, and a front-page headline that made even I pause. From empire to embarrassment. How one man's ego is destroying Westbien and Company. The article was brutal. Surgical. They outlined Colton's firing spree, the lawsuits, the vendor walkouts, and, most damning of all, the hidden licensing clause that Richard Westbien had signed in my favor. They quoted legal experts who said Colton's actions could serve as a case study in executive malpractice. They even posted side-by-side photos. Richard in a modest gray suit shaking hands at a charity gala, and Colton in a nightclub, holding a champagne bottle bigger than his vision statement. The story caught fire. LinkedIn flooded with hot takes. Former employees, once silent, shared stories of Colton's arrogance, how he talked down to senior staff, dismissed expert advice, and replaced seasoned professionals with personal friends. One thread titled, "I got fired by a trust fund baby and laughed all the way to a better job," got over 100,000 likes. Within days, news segments picked it up. Stockholders called emergency meetings. A petition titled "Save Westbien from Westbien" gained traction. Even satire sites got involved. One photoshopped Colton's face onto a toddler throwing a tantrum with a caption, "When daddy leaves you the sandbox and you eat the sand." The final nail. A televised panel on national business media. One of the guests, an industry analyst I'd worked with years ago, summed it up like this: Colton Westbourne fired the only man keeping his company alive, not realizing that man held more power off the payroll than he ever did with a title. That clip went viral. And for the first time since his takeover, Colton went dark. No statements. No press appearances. No video memos. His social media went quiet. His LinkedIn title changed from CEO Westbourne and Company to simply, currently rebuilding. He wasn't rebuilding. He was hiding. Because now it wasn't just the board or investors watching him. It was everyone. And while his father's legacy smoldered behind him, I was preparing for the final move. Not revenge. Redemption. The kind that isn't loud, but leaves a legacy that speaks louder than any microphone ever could. The final move wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It happened in a quiet boardroom on the 27th floor of a downtown high-rise. No cameras. No press. Just me, a notary, and two very calm, very expensive attorneys who'd flown in from New York to finalize the deal. What deal? The one that gave me controlling stake in a company Colton didn't even see coming. Ravencore Industries, our closest competitor and the same firm Colton once mocked during a podcast interview. Months earlier, as he was too busy chest-puffing his way through executive chairs, I'd quietly begun negotiations. Ravencore had been circling our clients like vultures ever since Colton took over. But they didn't want scraps. They wanted infrastructure, talent, and legacy. And I had all three. They didn't buy me. I bought into them. With the leverage I held over Westbourne's supply chain, IP licenses, and executive ties. We created a new joint venture with a single purpose. Replace Westbourne and Company from the inside out. And it worked faster than we expected. Within a month, former Westbourne employees were applying to Ravencore in droves. Clients followed. Vendors who ghosted Colton returned my calls with urgency. We didn't even have to pitch. They came to us. But the real dagger, that came at the Westbourne shareholders' emergency meeting, where Colton was expected to provide a turnaround strategy. Instead, what he got was me. I walked into that room wearing the same suit I'd worn the day he fired me. Not out of sentiment. Out of strategy. He looked up from his seat, pale and thinner than I remembered. His signature arrogance had faded into something unfamiliar. Fear. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The room buzzed as I took my seat beside the lead investor. One of the board members leaned over and whispered, "We heard you're behind the acquisition." I just nodded. That day, Ravencore announced a full buyout of Westbourne and Company's intellectual property and assets. The board approved it. Unanimously. The price. Pennies on the dollar. Because Colton's incompetence had tanked the valuation. It wasn't a merger. It was a takeover. And just like that, the company he inherited no longer belonged to him. Colton sat frozen as the votes rolled in. His glassy jaw clenched. I could almost hear the words trying to form, but none came. He wasn't just losing a title. He was losing his father's legacy. To the man he humiliated. The man he dismissed. The man who walked away without a word. But came back with everything. It was quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in empty rooms or dead offices, but the kind that comes with closure. I stood at the top floor of Ravencore's new headquarters. The morning sun spilling through glass panels, casting golden streaks across the polished floor. The city stretched out beneath me, buzzing, breathing, unaware that a legacy had just changed hands. My hands. The old Westbourne clients had fully integrated. The systems I once built under Richard's mentorship were now refined, leaner, sharper, free from ego, bureaucracy, or the entitled decay that had ruined the company I once loved. The culture we'd rebuilt at Ravencore wasn't about titles. It was about trust. And then came the final email. Subject. Official resignation. Colton Westbourne. No words in the body. Just an attached letter. 3 paragraphs of hollow professionalism and empty gratitude. Closed with a signature that felt smaller than it once did. I didn't respond. Instead, I closed my laptop, stood from my chair, and walked to the glass wall overlooking the city. Behind me, on the wall of my new office, hung a single framed photograph. Me and Richard Westburn arm in arm after signing our first major licensing deal. We were younger, proud, and exhausted in the best way. I hadn't put it there to mock what was lost. I put it there to remember what was worth saving. Because this wasn't revenge anymore. It was restoration. Richard once told me, legacy isn't about who inherits the company. It's about who's willing to carry the weight when it gets heavy. I had carried it, quietly, faithfully. And now I stood tall, not just as a survivor of corporate betrayal, but as the architect of something better. Word spread quickly. Industry leaders began calling again, not just out of respect but out of genuine trust. I wasn't just the man who'd beaten Colton Westburn. I was the man who reminded everyone what leadership actually looks like. And Colton, he vanished into the background. A footnote in the company's history. Rumor has it he moved overseas, trying to launch a startup, but no one returned his calls. Because in the end, his last name couldn't open the doors his behavior had closed. As for me, I walked through the halls of my new company, my real company, with calm steps and clear eyes. No speeches, no theatrics, just quiet leadership. And as I passed the new interns, analysts, and department heads, I heard one of them whisper, "That's him. That's the guy who rebuilt everything. Not the guy who got fired. The guy who finished the story."